Yesterday, I was watching a documentary on the White House Farm murders in Essex in 1985. Now, if you're not familiar with the case, this was a notorious familicide. That is an entire family being killed outside the village of Tolsant-Darcy in the English county of Essex. Um, and the case attracted a lot of attention because of the unusual circumstances around it. Um, and the fact that there are still significant question marks over that case. It was recently dramatized by ITV, and basically, what initially appeared to be a situation of the mentally unstable model daughter committing the murders. This was two young boys, her two sons, I understand, and two the middle-aged father and mother, and then the daughter herself. What was initially deemed to be a straightforward case of murder-suicide then transpired that there's more to it, and the son, who alerted the police, then found himself being charged with the murders, and he has subsequently served a life sentence, and he is still in prison ever since. Jeremy Bamber. This, of course, has attracted a lot of scrutiny, debate, documentaries, and like I said, that dramatization. Um, Now, I'm not going to go into every aspect of the case because it's not the main point of this video, but just a brief outline. So basically, the prosecution's case lay on the fact that there was a silencer, and they managed to convince the jury that had this silencer indeed been used, then it couldn't have been the young woman, Sylvia, I think Claflin was her name. That don't quote me on that. I'm going by memory here. Um, but they argued that she couldn't have committed the crimes because she wouldn't have had the reach to be able to kill herself in that way. Now, what happened was the cousins, who then sort of probed the cottage afterwards, the farm, found this silencer, gave it to the police, and that was used to prosecute Jeremy Bamber. And the rationale was that he sought to gain inheritance. Now, the interesting thing about that case is that to this day, Jeremy Bamber maintains his innocence. Bear in mind, he's now been in prison for over 30 years, which would mean that if he is innocent, that would be possibly the longest miscarriage of justice in British legal history. I'm not saying he's innocent, but my gut feeling is there are some question marks around the case. One of them is this: if he was guilty, I think by now a guilty man would have just conceded that he's never going to get out. And so, what's the point of maintaining innocence? There's actually a sort of legal loophole whereby, and I'm not sure if this applies so much in the UK, if it's more an American system, whereby one can only get parole if they've been charged with a serious crime. They can only get parole if they acknowledge their guilt. Now, this is kind of a legal term called the innocent prisoner's dilemma, whereby they'll only get parole, they'll only be released early if they admit that they committed the crime. But if they're innocent, the the logic is they would rather spend longer in jail on principle rather than admit something they didn't do. Now, on this guideline, although Jeremy Bamber was given a life sentence at the time, I believe it was 25 years, that's already surpassed. It's now over 30 years. So it's possible that Jeremy Bamber could have been released a few years ago, but he wasn't. He maintains his innocence. My gut feeling is if this man was guilty, he would have just conceded it at some point. Um, so my gut feeling is swaying towards he might actually be innocent, and I do think it's problematic that a lot of the evidence lay in that which was produced by the cousins. Not Essex police. It seemed that their handling of it was quite sloppy. Um, there was transcripts that emerged, a documentary I watched last night, that father had indeed made a call to Chelmsford Police Station, which seems to have been disregarded at the time, or at least not brought into the trial. And also, a lot of the testimony rested on Jeremy Bamber's ex-girlfriend. Bamber had a bit of a reputation as a womanizer. Um, it isn't far-fetched to imagine that she might have been bitter. Now, I wasn't in the trial. I don't know what happened. I don't know if he's innocent or guilty. But I do think there is a lot of question marks over this case. So anyway, it got me into thinking about miscarriages of justice in legal history. And I'm not saying that the Jeremy Bamber case is a miscarriage of justice. There are many people who believe he was indeed guilty, people closely involved with the case. He might be. I just don't know. Um, Although I would say that the argument that he was the only one that sought to gain inheritance, or was in a position to gain inheritance isn't true, because the cousins then got acquisition of the farm, so they could have gained from it. I don't know. I just don't know. I wasn't there. But anyway, looking at miscarriages of justice, unfortunately, this country has more than its fair share. I've always been pretty conservative on crime. I believe in tough justice for heinous crimes, and it doesn't get much worse than killing a family of five, including two young boys. But if we look over some high-profile cases, I'll go via the Wikipedia link because it's convenient. I'm going to focus on Britain because it simply wouldn't be possible to cover every high-profile case around the world. But suffice to say, in countries that have the death penalty, such as China, there's no going back from it. There's been several cases in China where a suspect has been executed, only later for them to be cleared and their families been given compensation, but that doesn't bring them back. There's cases in the United States where people have served decades behind bars only to be cleared. And I do think there is a problem with the way African American suspects are treated more often than not. I'm not saying that white suspects always get an easy ride either, but I think it would be, I do think there are serious problems in the American justice system. Now, having said that, I don't want to focus on other countries because there's simply not time to do all that in one video. I want to just kind of draw awareness of some of these high profile cases in our legal history. And it's a terrible thing. Injustice is terrible when a victim of serious crime doesn't get justice. Lenient justice is wrong, in my opinion, but so is a miscarriage of justice. So I'm going to read out some high-profile cases, and this is by no means exhaustive. Oscar Slater, 1908, is that's the year. I'll just double check this. 1908 is the year of the crime, and this was in Glasgow. This was a case where he was wrongfully convicted in 1909 of the murder of Marion Gilchrist. On the flimsiest of evidence, he was sentenced to death. His sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he served hard labour for 19 years until his conviction was quashed in 1928. So this was one of the most egregious cases in the early 20th century, the Oscar Slater case. William Herbert Wallace in Liverpool, 1931. Again, this was a murder charge. He was convicted of murdering his wife, but the conviction was overturned by the Court of Criminal Appeal in 1931, the first such instance of a capital conviction being quashed. And this, to me, is one of the major arguments against the death penalty, because whilst an innocent person, it would destroy their life to go to prison for years, at least they could still be alive to get compensation or at least try to rebuild their life. With a death sentence, that isn't possible, obviously. Timothy Evans, notorious case, 1949, London. This is the notorious 10 Rillington Place murders, which were actually perpetrated by John Christie. Now, Timothy Evans was a young Welshman. He had some learning difficulties. This was dramatised by the film 10 Rillington Place with um, Richard Attenborough. And basically, Christie was a very manipulative character. He managed to convince Timothy Evans to confess, but this was a major miscarriage of justice. Evans was executed, I believe, in 1950. No, yeah, 1950. He was hanged in 1950, and was later found out to be that Christie was a serial killer who'd actually coerced Evans into confessing, and Evans was posthumously pardoned. So that's a famous case. Um, Derek Bentley, another notorious case, took years for that to be overturned. 1952. Again, that was dramatised by a film starring, I think it was Christopher Eccleston, and that was a murder of a policeman. Now, in the early 50s, if a police officer died, that almost always resulted in a mandatory death sentence in Britain. So what happened was Bentley was 19, but he had mental age much younger, and his young accomplice, who was 16, Christopher Craig was actually a lot more violent, and he was kind of leading the two, although he was younger. But a 16-year-old couldn't be executed. So this police officer was killed, and there's still a lot of debate over what exactly happened because the word "let him have it" was said. Now, this could have meant Bentley saying, "let him have the gun," as in hand it over, or it could have meant "let him have it," as in shoot him. And that was a big part of the prosecution, understanding of those words. But Derek Bentley was hanged in 1953, and it wasn't until the 1990s, 1998 in fact, that the Court of Appeal quashed Bentley's conviction for murder. And actually, on his gravestone, it says, his headstone, it says, "I believe a victim of British justice." So that was one of the most egregious and notorious miscarriages of justice, the Derek Bentley case. Um, Liam Holden, 1972. This is one of many cases related to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. He was convicted of murdering a British soldier in 1973. Now, this is something I didn't realise. Ulster actually still had the death penalty in statute until 1973, whereas in mainland Great Britain it had been abolished formally in 1968, I believe, although the last executions were 1964. But basically, he was convicted of murdering a British soldier. He later claimed to have been forced to sign a confession by soldiers who tortured and threatened to shoot him. Definitely not one of our more glorious moments. Um, there were, I believe, human rights abuses that took place under Operation Banner. But anyway, he became the last person ever sentenced to death by a British court. But it was never upheld. He was never executed. But after the death penalty was abolished in Northern Ireland, Holden's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released on licence in 1989. In 2012, an appeals court overturned his conviction. So this guy served 17 years for a crime that was based on coercion and basically torture. Stephen Downing, another notorious case. This was the murder of Wendy Sewell in Bakewell in Derbyshire, 1973. He was a council worker, just 17 years old. He had learning difficulties, and he had a reading age of 11. So he worked as a cemetery as a gardener. The police made him sign a confession that he was unable to read. The case gained international notoriety as the Bakewell Park murder, which is a bit tasteless, really, when you think about it. Probably the tabloids coined that. uh, a young woman was murdered and raped. After spending 27 years in prison, Downing was released in 2001 and its conviction overturned in 2002, and it ranks as one of the longest miscarriages of justice in British criminal history. There's other cases related to the Troubles I'll just touch on. The Judith Ward case, 1974. She was convicted of the M62 coach bombing near Leeds, which killed 12 people. The Birmingham 6 case, of course. I'm familiar with that case because my local MP, my former local MP, Chris Mullen, was heavily involved in the bid to clear their name. They were convicted of the Birmingham Pub Bombings in 1974, which killed 21 people. And that case is reopened, incidentally. It still hasn't been solved who the actual culprits were. So the 21 victims still haven't, their families still haven't got justice. Around the same time as the Birmingham 6 case was the Guildford 4 and Maguire 7. Again, this is related to the Troubles. And in February 2005, Tony Blair issued a public apology to the Maguire Seven and the Guildford Four for the miscarriages of justice they'd suffered. Um, I'm not reading out every single case here, there simply isn't time in one video, but I will talk about this one because it's a particularly egregious case. Stefan Kitchko. This was related to the 1975 rape and murder of a young girl, Leslie Molseed. Um, and he was convicted in 1976. He spent 16 years in prison before he was released in 1992 after a long campaign by his mother, and he died of a heart attack shortly afterwards. at the age of 41. And like other cases here, Stefan Kitchko had some learning difficulties. He was a vulnerable person. Shamefully, there was two girls that implicated him. I don't know if they ever faced justice for their false testimony. I hope they did. But in 2007, Ronald Kistry of Oldham, Shaw, near Oldham, was arrested on DNA evidence, which of course wasn't widely used in the 70s. Was convicted of Leslie Moseed's murder at Bradford Crown Court and jailed for life. But that was one of the most egregious cases because the tabloids at the time were paying for his blood, and I believe he got attacked in prison.